environment, I don't have a problem if you want to interrupt and like post a question, whenever, right? Otherwise I'm just gonna sort of plow through it and we'll do questions and answers at the end. But I'm flexible either way if you wanna stop and get something clarified. So this is the Fairness Alberta was set up, I guess 3.5 years ago, the scheme came together. But there was a previous entity that we tried to start up in 2012, 2013, where we had a bunch of folks that we used to meet in Red Deer, a bunch of Calgary folks and Edmonton folks. And at that time, we identified a lot of structural problems, but we weren't able to get traction with enough funding to put an actual entity together. So we agreed to grumble a lot and keep grumbling, but we decided not to do anything structurally. And then around midway through 2018, toward the end of 2018, the grumbling got louder, and a couple colleagues of mine told me that they thought I wasn't being productive enough, and it was time to, put our time and effort, set up a society, and we put the entity in place with the board, hired a really talented executive director, and we kicked off aggressively sort of late 2019. COVID did initially look like a big headache because we were sort of not just had put the packaging together and we're going out to raise money, and then all the presentations got sort of put on hold, when COVID hit. But if you sort of look back at it now, it was a very successful startup because during that sort of initial period, we raised about $300,000 and we spent $300,000, and we still spend money at a fairly regular clip. But the entity is at the stage now where it has a fair amount of credibility, and it's gone in a manner that's pretty. I'm happy with it, right? So, can you guys?
We can't hear you right now.
Oh, you can't hear it. You guys can hear me. Do you want me to hold the thing? Is this?
Okay, we're good. Okay, we're good.
You're
now.
good. Okay,
Yeah, we're good.
fair enough. Okay, so now maybe I think we should just flip to the PowerPoints and we'll start walking through the PowerPoint. So the mandate is to inform Canadians about Alberta's contributions while also outlining the grievances we have, and we focus on federal issues that are problematic. And this is an interesting, at one point we actually did buy this billboard right on Bay Street. And it's a pretty cool billboard because it basically said, Ontario, you're not going to be able to pay for everything by yourself, right? And it got quite a bit of attention at the time when we did put up a similar billboard in Ottawa at the same time. So the basic idea is to say that we want to change federal policies to improve Alberta's position, and we argue also improve Canada's position. Their alignment with other provinces we'll talk about in a little while. But what we see happening at some point in the future is that these major changes become the subject of federal-provincial negotiations, and there is pressure to make the federal government make changes. When we'll get into it. So we're not actually proposing stuff that needs constitutional change. We're proposing things that are all federal policies that all could be changed, through political pressure. Practically, none of this will ever happen without Ontario on side. So you'll hear me come back to the theme that we're putting the time and effort and resources into doing the advocacy and the education and the fighting in Ontario, and in Toronto, GTA primarily, with the view that eventually we would have an ally that would then push it over the top with whoever is in Ottawa. Okay, so that, in our view, if we don't take that sort of approach to changing things, we think otherwise we're just going to incite a bunch of angry Albertans, but we'll never change anything in Ottawa. Okay, so that's the basic thrust of the thing. Some of the things we'd like to change are small, and others are big, right? And we've already had some impact. So we did wade in, although we are focused on federal policies, we did wade into supporting the equalization referendum because it looked like it was going sideways, and there really wasn't anybody speaking to it. So, our executive director became the guy that set the record straight, and I think we had a big impact on getting to the 60-some% that we eventually got to. We also have been involved with other groups in fighting other fights. So we were very active back about 18 months ago fighting on the clean fuel standard to keep the gaseous elements out of the clean fuel standard changes. The clean fuel standard is like a huge deal, and it's going to impose big costs on the economy in different areas. But it would have been even a bigger deal if they included all the natural gas in the program. So that's essentially the idea of what it's about. Wrong direction.
Sorry.
It's okay. I'll wait for you. So why we're different, and when we set this entity up, we did do market research, like not in a formal sense of any sort of sampling, but we went and checked out all the groups that already existed to see if there actually was too much overlap or whether there was a need. And it turns out that we are unique and it is different and it was needed. And we're unique because, first of all, it is nonpartisan. So most of the groups out there are very aggressively partisan. And that we're not being condescending towards them, like they have a role and they have their place, but they have a hard time getting the media to pick them up. Okay? So by being nonpartisan and explicitly non-separatist and being very fact-based, we are able to get traction with the media. So they phone us for comments on stuff all the time. And that positioning with the media helps. So also when we write op-eds or something, they post it. Like we actually have the ability to get them to put our stuff out there, right? So we would say we're different because it's fact-based, it's nonpartisan, but we're not a think tank in that we're way more aggressive than a think tank. Like a think tank's not going to buy a billboard, right? So we'll take a position that's quite aggressive to make the case. So essentially what we want, I think I've covered all of this, so we'll move to the next, that's good. So going forward this year, and our key is to continue building our brand, which we think is well positioned and we need to build on it. Most of our activity over the last little while was fiscal. We got really involved in a lot of information on the equalization program and on some other fiscal issues. We weighed in on the federal stabilization program, and all of that. We're going to segue a little bit more into getting involved more in the energy policies, okay? However, we can't leave the equalization altogether because the timing of that program is such that it's supposed to come up for a potential renewal or renegotiation in 2024. The last couple of times they blew by it and didn't amend it, didn't reform it, and the kind of crappy deal that was negotiated 20 years ago just keeps getting rolled over. So we're now trying to push hard to get them at the table to actually fix the problems with the program. Okay, and we're not saying there shouldn't be any equalization program, but we'll talk a little bit about things that are wrong with it. But it's very clear that it needs to be fixed, and it's hurting Albertans, but it's also hurting folks in BC and Ontario as well, right? And it's not really achieving the goals that it was set out to achieve.
Who's it helping?
Most of the money goes to Quebec and the Maritimes, right? So Manitoba gets a little bit, but Quebec gets an amount that's way more than they should get if the program was structured possible.
Do they really need the help?
Oh, it's in the eye of the beholder. They're setting up their own savings plan, in part because they're getting so much help, right? So, they'll have their own trust fund. So, I would argue that they are very good at negotiating. And when this was negotiated 20 years ago, they did their homework and others didn't. The Unjust Transition Campaign, we coined this last year, and it's actually become a popular thing. So we'll walk through some slides that explains why the proposed approach to sort of phase out of fossil fuels is inappropriate and misguided. So we'll talk about that. And this is an area that we're now focusing on in terms of where we want to spend the money over the next little while.
Oh, it didn't progress.
No, it didn't move yet. Okay, so we'll talk about the equalization stuff for a minute. This is a lot of data, and I know nobody wants to look at tables with a lot of data. But if you just jump to the yellow highlighted charts, you can see that over the course of the time from 2022 to today, the program keeps growing, you know, by a lot, okay? And it's a lot of money, and, you know, so essentially $27 billion gets handed out to the Maritimes and Quebec, okay, based on that program. That's the 2027, that's the forecast. Like if it keeps going the route, the way it's going now, that's what you get to by 2027. And the problem is, the way they wrote it, the program automatically expands every year regardless of the difference between the provinces. Okay, so let's flip to the next one. But the provinces have shrunk. The way they measure fiscal capacity, your ability to pay for your social programs, you know, yeah, like there used to be a big difference. There's hardly any difference now. But the pie is bigger, and so you don't actually even need much of a program now. But in fact, there's a massive windfall because we're sharing a bigger pie with little justification for it because the fiscal capacity has shrunk so much. So in fact, we would argue that the program should be correlated mathematically to the size of the difference in the fiscal capacity, not just on some automatic trajectory every year, which you know is billions. Next page. So these are the provinces that get hit the most on a per capita. Alberta does get hit the most on per capita, but BC and Ontario get hit too. So on this particular policy issue, we should have allies. And the federal political reality today is, do you know if you won Ontario, BC, and Alberta, you win? You don't actually need Quebec anymore, right? So if folks would actually if we could take this topic, now of course there's other issues that people in, you know, Greater Toronto or Greater Vancouver vote on, you know, but the point is, there's something that we should have some alignment on. Next slide. So here's an interesting thing. So we complain about equalization, but the total fiscal flow of money from Alberta to the rest of the country, you know, is in the range over time of $20 billion a year. Now this is before the pandemic. Once the pandemic hit, it just became messed up. In fact, you know, we ended up getting money, right? Now as we roll out of the pandemic, we're going to be back up very quickly to the $20 billion. That's a big number. About half of, and that's not the government sending a check, that's all of the people and the companies. It's a Statistics Canada calculation that one of our key founders, Fred McDougall, actually did in 2016, where he pulled all the Stats Can data and said all the money that goes in either direction, money spent in Alberta versus taxes, or all the money that flows to Ottawa, and the net was, on average, is negative $20 billion for Alberta, whereas, you know, Quebec's about, you know, 15 on the other side, right? So essentially, though, of the net $20 billion a year, the equalization part is only 3 of it. The rest of it is just the fact that we pay too much taxes compared to the services that are spent in Alberta. But effectively, Albertans subsidize the rest of the country to the tune of $20 billion, and the equalization is the high-profile part, you know, but it's only 15% of what the problem is. The problem is the federal government is in provincial jurisdiction every day. Health funding, you know, like all the social programs, and essentially by being in that so much in provincial jurisdiction, and we make more money on average here. Every time we send more taxes to Ottawa, it churns in a way that we have about a 15% surtax by the time the programs get paid. Right? So the worst thing for Alberta is actually to ask for more federal health transfers, because all that means is we send more taxes and we lose 17% on the way through with all the money. So we really would want is to say, just give us more tax room and get out of provincial jurisdiction and let us, you know, pay for everything with provincial taxes rather than having federal transfers. But it's in the best interest of other provinces to have it churn its way through Ottawa, because they disproportionately get more, you know, at the end of the day. So that's just something that isn't well understood, and the equalization story is easier to tell, but this is actually a way bigger problem than the equalization story.
When you say it churns through, is that beneficial to Ontario or not?
Ontario is a little net negative, but they're almost pretty neutral on it. on this thing, on this issue, Ontario's pretty neutral, but Quebec and the Maritimes get a good deal out of it. Alberta's way, in worse circumstances than others, in this regard. Let's go to the next one. So I want to talk about the unjust transition, because this is where we're going to shift a lot of our efforts and where we want to spend our money. Okay, so next slide. So we've already been able to get, so Bill Buick is our executive director. Bill's actually taken a leave of absence, so he's running another job for a few months, but he's still in the background part-time writing for us. The movie star on some of the future press going forward, it's not going to be me, it's going to be Lee. So Lee's going to be the interim movie star and covering for Bill over the course of the next few months if it's needed. But Bill has done just a great job of positioning this topic already. So already the National Post prints his stuff, right? So as we're trying to make the case about the unjust transition, we've already got traction, in the media based upon the information we've presented. Next. I've already talked about the political reality that creates an opportunity. The other reason we have an opportunity is the Russia-Ukraine situation, which has also led to a cost of living issue. And the other problem that we have to get across is the nature of the federal greenhouse gas policies and how, they're over the top in terms of their impact on the province going forward. And one of the key points to make about that is there is too much of the investment just leaks out and gets built in Louisiana or Texas or somewhere else, as folks, that would have otherwise invested in Alberta don't want to pay the differential carbon tax. Okay, so it's not just feeling good about a higher carbon tax isn't actually necessarily, ultimately reducing, the emissions if the same upgrader or the LNG plant gets built in Louisiana. Okay. Next slide. So we're going to go through some slides that we've been using that you can get a sense of the message, a little bit of what we're saying to folks. Also, smarter people than I have been doing some online stuff that's got some really good metrics back. And in fact, their feedback loop that they get on the stuff into Ottawa and Toronto, there's a lot of attention being paid to this stuff on the advertising that we're putting online. So we can measure that, and that's actually being useful. And so this is sort of how it's spent now. And, so this is one of them. Just so this tells you who the top oil and gas producing countries are. And if Canada is not going to be producing, if we're going to get out of the business of oil and gas, you don't have a lot of really good choices to replace us. In terms of the nature of the countries and who are the allies and who will or won't use the resource in a political manner. The next slide, please. This is another thing based on statistics. While we've crashed down our percentage of the global share, the Russians have increased it. So we've dramatically stopped investing, since, the crash really didn't happen until 2015, but since 2010 we've actually stopped investing as much. We accelerated that since 2015, but Russia had gone up about the same amount. This is a pitch to Ontario that they get a lot out of it. The biggest thing they get out of it is fundamentally the federal government makes a lot of money off of us, which is part of the calculations we talked about before. But this is important for us to make the case to Ontario. Next. This is a big deal, we think. So we aren't dinosaurs that say you shouldn't have reduced carbon. Like one of the big projects I'm involved in running now is the big Air Products hydrogen plant that's under construction now. And it's capturing all the CO2 and it's progressive. And the government has policies to encourage that. And Fairness Alberta agrees that Alberta and Canada should be a leader in environmental policies, including greenhouse gas. but there's a difference between being a leader and being a masochist, okay? And so, we could, so theoretically, you should benchmark against your competitors and say, like, we'll always be 10%, better than the competitors in greenhouse gas intensity or whatever measurement you want. But we shouldn't say, well, we're gonna get out of that business. Like, just saying we're gonna get out of the business, all we do is move the investment somewhere else. The other thing to put it in perspective, though, is we're not making that big a difference. So this target for 2030 that was recently thrown out by the feds, this massive reduction by 2030 for the oil sands, it's totally impractical. Like, they just can't do it. And that, if you look at this graph, that's how much that would do. And this is what China does in 1 year of new coal plants, new plants in 1 year, right? So we could decimate the oil sands, and it's a fraction of what China's building in 1 year. And the CO2 is, of course, a global thing. It's not a local environmental thing. It's a global thing. So we need to understand that if we're going to put hundreds of thousands of people out of work, in 3 or 4 provinces in this country, that, like, really how much of a difference are we making? We're not making a whole hell of a lot of difference if it's okay, for, dozens of coal plants, get new coal plants to be built every year in China. This is another thing that says the same thing. So that's the total oil sands emissions. That's new coal 1 year, or like 18 months, I can't remember the exact measurement. And this is what their total coal is today, right? So, let's put it in context that if we're gonna be forced to basically shut down the oil and gas industry, we're basically putting hundreds of thousands of people out of work in the context of this math, okay? And I think what we wanna do is present that to folks and educate them to put this into context, okay? And once people see this in context, we think they'll understand the nature of the just transition, being a bit foolhardy. Next slide. The LNG thing is another thing. So essentially, we blew the first round of the LNG investment where we'll end up with one plant. And we were way ahead of the Americans. And I remember our firm did a risk assessment of all the LNG projects on the West Coast before the Americans started building them. And we ended up it just didn't happen because we had regulatory and a whole lot of political problems, including an opposition in BC to gas-fired liquefaction as opposed to electric-fired liquefaction. Now that fight's now happening over Shell's potential doubling of their LNG plant, in that they're saying you don't have enough hydropower, it'll be too expensive, we have to use gas-fired, and they're saying we're going to go gas, and now everybody's up in arms in BC, that they're going to be this massive contribution to greenhouse gases. Well, in reality, they would be almost 1-for-1 reducing emissions in China if the LNG was built and it went to China. Like, so on a global basis, it's a massive improvement in greenhouse gas emissions. But the way we're parochial and we're pretending like we're all by ourselves. So, this is a big deal. And obviously on the East Coast, Europe needs gas, right? But we're not in a position to help them because some of these policies have been too dogmatic. Next one. So here's the issue on the carbon tax. And again, it's kind of back to the let's be leaders, but we don't have to be masochists. And I don't know if that phrase, it's a simple one for me to use it. But the American states, the only American state with a carbon tax that's a significant oil and gas player is California, right? But they're not actually per capita a very big oil and gas player anymore. They're mostly a consumer. The green places are where most of the production is. All of those places do not have a carbon tax. Okay, we're going to go up to $170 a ton. So if you're going to build a refinery or a petrochemical plant, it's not going to happen here without huge subsidies to offset the carbon tax. Okay, now if the government puts enough programs in place and the subsidies are high enough, but then ultimately the taxpayers are paying for something, to offset a policy flaw. But we have this burden that is going to chase away investment either to the U.S. and most of the displaced leakage has ended up in Louisiana more recently. But it also goes to other places in the world. And also, when they rank competitiveness or investment attractiveness, none of the jurisdictions in Canada rank in the top 10 anymore from an objective investment. So what we want is, it was nice for you guys to listen to me, and I don't know whether this is a target audience for fundraising or not, but if it is, wonderful. But otherwise, we would like just support in general, or for you to talk about this with other people. But essentially, we want to take the Unjust Transition campaign and build on the positive momentum that we've got so far, and move it forward. We'll spend most of the money in Ontario for the next 6 months. If we just do social media stuff, we can get away with only $8,000 and be pretty small. But if we're going to buy billboards and be more aggressive online, we need $25,000 a month. That's sort of the target to make a big difference. We have some meetings coming up with some folks in Calgary that might allow us to crack this nut more quickly. But the fundraising is a challenge in this business. It's kind of weird. We did pretty well to raise $300,000, through COVID, and I think we produced as a result. But it's harder now, and it's a bit weird. We're not quite sure why the fundraising is harder now than it was before, but it is. And we're focusing a little more of our time in Calgary on the fundraising. We used to actually raise quite a bit in Edmonton, right? But we're moving a bit to sort of, with the Unjust Transition, there's more kind of energy focus in Calgary on those things. So that's where we hope to get a bulk of it. But this is a challenge right now, and so anybody that's interested in helping, we'd be keen. And I think that's about it. I think the last slide just gives us contact information. So that's my presentation.
Awesome, thank you.